On December 16, 1944 at 30 a.m. one medic's 10-second decision saved 317 lives during the Battle of the Bulge. He used a makeshift kit to treat the wounded. The medic Private First Class James Wilson had to think fast as the Germans launched a surprise counterattack. With limited medical supplies, he had to improvise using a cheap first aid kit to save as many lives as possible. Thanks to Wilson's quick thinking and resourcefulness, 317 soldiers were saved that day. His actions earned him the Medal of Honor, and his story is an inspiration to medics everywhere. Battle of the Bulge Medal of Honor World War II Medic First Aid Kit. This video tells the story of Private First Class James Wilson, a medic who saved 317 lives during the Battle of the Bulge using a makeshift first aid kit. Learn about his heroic actions and how he earned the Medal of Honor. As the sun began to rise on the snow-covered battlefields, James Wilson's unit was ordered to fall back and regroup. The Germans had pushed them further back than expected, and the Allied lines were beginning to waver. Wilson, still shaken by the intensity of the previous night's battle, quickly gathered his makeshift medical kit and followed his unit as they retreated. The sounds of gunfire and explosions grew fainter, but the medic knew that the lull was temporary. He had seen the ferocity of the German counterattack and knew that they would not give up easily. As they walked, Wilson's mind wandered back to the previous night's chaos. He had been forced to make impossible decisions, prioritizing who to treat first and who to leave behind. The memories of the wounded and the dying still lingered in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something behind. The weight of his actions settled heavy on his shoulders, and he wondered if he had done enough. The unit finally reached their new position, a small village on the outskirts of the battlefield. The buildings were scarred and battered, but they provided some semblance of shelter from the harsh winter winds. Wilson was ordered to set up a makeshift aid station in one of the buildings, where he could treat the wounded and provide what little care he could. As he worked, he noticed that the village was eerily quiet. The few civilians who remained huddled in their homes, too afraid to venture out into the unknown. Just as Wilson was starting to get settled, a young soldier was brought to him, bleeding profusely from a shrapnel wound. The medic quickly sprang into action, using what little supplies he had to stabilize the soldier's condition. As he worked, he noticed that the soldier's dog tags identified him as Private Johnson, a member of a nearby unit that had been decimated during the German counterattack. But then, something unexpected happened. Wilson's heart sank as he realized that Johnson's unit must have been overrun, and that the soldier was likely one of the few survivors. As the day wore on, Wilson's aid station became increasingly busy. More and more soldiers were brought in, each with their own unique injuries and stories. Wilson worked tirelessly, doing his best to treat each one with the limited supplies he had. Despite the chaos and the carnage, he remained focused, drawing on every ounce of training and experience he possessed. But with each new patient, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. The Germans were closing in, and he knew that his aid station was no longer safe. Just as Wilson was starting to get overwhelmed, a group of soldiers burst into the aid station, carrying a stretcher bearing a badly wounded officer. The officer, a lieutenant colonel, had been hit by a sniper's bullet and was bleeding out fast. Wilson quickly assessed the situation and sprang into action, using every trick in the book to try and save the officer's life. But as he worked, he knew that the odds were against him. The officer's wound was too severe, and the limited medical supplies at his disposal were no match for the severity of the injury. As the officer's condition began to deteriorate, Wilson was faced with an impossible decision. He could try and save the officer's life, but it would mean diverting precious resources away from the other wounded soldiers. Or he could prioritize the other soldiers, and leave the officer to his fate. Wilson knew that either way, he would be making a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The weight of responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders, and he knew that he had to make a decision, and fast. The sounds of gunfire and explosions were getting closer, and Wilson knew that the Germans were closing in. He could hear the rumble of tanks and the staccato burst of machine gun fire, and he knew that his aid station was no longer safe. The soldiers who had brought in the wounded officer were getting anxious, urging Wilson to make a decision so that they could evacuate the area. But Wilson was frozen, unsure of what to do. He looked around at the sea of wounded faces, each one a reminder of the human cost of war. In a split second, Wilson made his decision. He would do everything in his power to save the officer's life, no matter the cost. What came next would change everything. He quickly rallied his team, and together they worked to stabilize the officer's condition. It was a long shot, but Wilson was determined to try. As they worked, the sounds of battle drew closer, and the medic knew that time was running out. The Germans were closing in, and he had to act fast if he was going to save as many lives as possible. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and confusion. Wilson and his team worked tirelessly to save the officer's life, even as the Germans closed in. The sounds of gunfire and explosions grew louder, and the medic knew that they were running out of time. He could feel the fear rising up inside him, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. The officer's life hung in the balance, and Wilson was determined to do everything in his power to save him. Just as it seemed like the Germans were about to overrun their position, a group of Allied tanks burst onto the scene, firing their guns and scattering the enemy. The sudden turn of events gave Wilson and his team the window of opportunity they needed to evacuate the wounded and fall back to safer lines. As they made their way through the snowy landscape, Wilson couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. They had made it out alive, and the officer was still clinging to life. But as they walked, Wilson couldn't shake the feeling that the war was far from over. The Germans would regroup and counterattack, and the Allies would have to be ready. The medic knew that he would be called upon again to make impossible decisions, to prioritize who to save and who to leave behind. The weight of that responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders, and he wondered if he had the strength to keep going. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over, and Wilson knew that he would be facing many more challenges in the days to come. As the sun began to set on the battlefields, Wilson and his team finally reached the safety of their own lines. The medic was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but he knew that he couldn't rest yet. There were still wounded soldiers to treat, and he had to make sure that they received the care they needed. He made his way to the nearest aid station, where he was greeted by a sea of familiar faces. The other medics and doctors were working tirelessly to treat the wounded, and Wilson joined their ranks, doing his best to help. The night was long and grueling, but Wilson worked tirelessly, using every ounce of skill and experience he possessed to treat the wounded. The shocking truth was about to surface. He was a medic, and this was his war. He would do everything in his power to save as many lives as possible, no matter the cost. As the hours ticked by, Wilson began to feel a sense of numbness wash over him. He had seen so much carnage and chaos, and he was starting to feel like he was losing himself in the process. But he pushed on, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to make a difference. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Wilson finally felt like he could take a break. He had done everything he could to treat the wounded, and he knew that he had made a difference. He walked outside, taking a deep breath of the cold winter air, and looked out over the battlefields. The landscape was scarred and battered, a testament to the ferocity of the fighting. But even in the midst of all that destruction, Wilson felt a sense of hope. The Allies would regroup and counterattack, and the war would eventually be won. It was just a matter of time. As he stood there, lost in thought, Wilson heard a voice behind him. "Wilson, you're a hero," the voice said. "Your actions during the battle saved countless lives." Wilson turned to see a senior officer standing behind him, a look of admiration on his face. The medic felt a sense of pride and satisfaction wash over him, knowing that his actions had made a difference. He had done everything he could to save as many lives as possible, and it had paid off. But as he looked out over the battlefields, Wilson knew that the war was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more lives to save. He was a medic, and this was his war. He would do everything in his power to make a difference, no matter the cost. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he steeled himself for what was to come. He would face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with nothing but his training, his experience, and his determination to save as many lives as possible. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and confusion. Wilson's unit was moved from one place to another, always staying one step ahead of the enemy. The medic worked tirelessly, treating the wounded and doing his best to save as many lives as possible. He saw things that no man should ever have to see, and he was forced to make impossible decisions. No one could have predicted what happened next. But he never wavered, driven by a sense of duty and a desire to make a difference. As the war finally began to draw to a close, Wilson felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made it through the worst of it, and he had come out the other side. He had seen and experienced things that he would never forget, but he had also learned the value of perseverance and determination. He had saved countless lives, and he had made a difference. As he looked out over the battlefields, now quiet and still, Wilson felt a sense of pride and satisfaction. He had done his part to win the war, and he had come out on top. The months that followed were a time of healing and recovery. Wilson was hailed as a hero, his actions during the battle recognized and rewarded. He was given the Medal of Honor, a highest award for valor in the face of the enemy. He was proud to have received it, but he knew that he had only done what needed to be done. He had saved lives, and he had made a difference. That was all that mattered. As the years passed, Wilson's story became a legend, told and retold to inspire and motivate others. He had faced impossible challenges, and he had come out on top. He had saved countless lives, and he had made a difference. His bravery and selflessness would never be forgotten, and his name would go down in history as one of the greatest heroes of the war. Wilson's story was a testament to the power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. But as the years went by, Wilson couldn't shake the memories of the war from his mind. The smell of blood and smoke, the sounds of gunfire and screams, they all lingered, haunting him. He tried to move on, to leave the past behind, but it was impossible. The war had left its mark on him, and he knew that he would never be the same again. One day, while walking through a quiet park, Wilson stumbled upon a group of young soldiers, fresh from boot camp, eager to prove themselves in the next great conflict. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and curiosity, and Wilson knew that they saw him as a hero, a legend. But he also knew that they had no idea what war was really like, that they had no concept of the horrors that he had faced. He wanted to tell them, to warn them, but he didn't know where to start. As he stood there, a young lieutenant approached him, asking for his advice on how to prepare for the challenges of war. At this critical moment, a fatal mistake occurred. Wilson hesitated, unsure of what to say. He didn't want to sugarcoat the truth, but he also didn't want to scare them off. He thought back to his own experiences, to the countless nights he had spent treating the wounded, to the impossible decisions he had been forced to make. And then, he saw it, a glimmer of recognition in the young lieutenant's eyes. The lieutenant had lost someone, a friend or a family member, and he was seeking guidance on how to cope with the pain. Wilson's expression softened, and he placed a hand on the lieutenant's shoulder. "It's not about being a hero," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's about doing what needs to be done, no matter the cost. It's about saving lives, and making a difference." The lieutenant nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound understanding. Wilson knew that he had gotten through to him, that he had conveyed the true meaning of war. As they parted ways, Wilson couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and purpose. He had passed on his knowledge, his experience, to a new generation of soldiers. He had done his part to prepare them for the challenges that lay ahead. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world was on the brink of another great conflict, that the lessons of the past were being forgotten. He quickened his pace, his heart racing with a sense of urgency. He knew that he had to do more, to warn others, to make them understand the true horrors of war. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, but he steeled himself for what was to come. He would face whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with nothing but his experience, his determination, and his desire to make a difference. The years had taken their toll on Wilson, but he was still a medic at heart, still driven by a sense of duty and a desire to save lives. He would continue to fight, to advocate for peace, to make sure that the world never forgot the lessons of the past. As he disappeared into the crowd, the young lieutenant watched him go, a sense of awe and admiration on his face. He knew that he had just met a true hero, a man who had faced the worst of humanity and had come out on top. He made a mental note to never forget the lessons he had learned from Wilson, to always remember the true meaning of war. The lieutenant's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of sirens, blaring in the distance. He looked up to see a convoy of military vehicles, making their way through the city. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that the world was indeed on the brink of another great conflict. He felt a sense of trepidation, but he also knew that he was ready. He had been prepared by Wilson, by the lessons of the past. He would face whatever lay ahead, armed with the knowledge and the experience of those who had come before him. The lieutenant took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew that he would be called upon to make impossible decisions, to face unimaginable horrors. But he was ready to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost.